boss to put some real action behind the rhetoric when they talk about making your workplace more inclusive? Find out how to hold their feet to the fire and demand diversity on the Diversity Dude podcast.
Hello there, and welcome to the Diversity Dude podcast. I'm your host, Lambert Fisher, marriage and family therapist, award winning author, and national speaker on the topic of multicultural awareness and diversity. And for those of you who are interested in even more positive and encouraging tips and strategies beyond what I share in podcasts like this, then feel free to check out my award winning book, Diversity in Clinical Practice, nationally recognized for the unique way in which it addresses the often difficult topic of multicultural awareness and diversity. Designed for more than just therapists, if you're a helping professional in any way, diversity in clinical practice can help you meet the greatest variety of cultural needs possible for those whom you serve. And it's available in paper and audiobook versions for your convenience. And if you haven't heard it yet, I invite you to visit TED.com and check out my talk called What to Do When You Offend Someone, where I offer a positive and practical perspective on how to navigate unintentional offenses in daily life. To date, it's been viewed over 500,000 times. Check it out for yourself. And if you're encouraged by it as well, share it with a friend. And whether it be through my one on one relationship building efforts as a therapist or my informing and empowering efforts as an author and speaker, know that my personal mission is to do my part to improve the world one strengthened relationship at a time. So, today I want to share with you an encouraging perspective on the difficult question of, is cultural oppression just an excuse? As I mentioned previously, when I get the opportunity to provide positive and shame free multicultural awareness and diversity training to professionals all over the country, one of the things I value most is the opportunity to invite and answer any question professionals may have on this often polarizing and divisive topic of diversity that may relieve the barrier to not only their understanding, but also their healthier interactions with those around them. Most recently, a question was asked by one individual, which became clear that it was an area of uncertainty by many individuals in that room. So much so that it was admittedly a barrier to their genuine desires to help meet the greatest variety of needs of those around them. The question I was asked was this: I hear so much about cultural oppression historically as well as today, but admittedly, since all of that ended when slavery ended years ago, doesn't continuing to talk about oppression now make it just another excuse for not working hard to make lives better for them and their entire community? Now, I've been a therapist for long enough to know that the question itself probably generated a lot of feelings for many of you listening, as it likely did when they tried to ask those questions previously in other environments, but in response, they received more reaction than direction. Personally, while I'm certainly a human as well, I also understand that in order for growth to occur, misunderstanding needs to be clarified, and genuine desire for understanding is worth honoring. So, in an effort to provide less of a history lesson and more of practical considerations that can guide understanding as well as healthy cross cultural interactions moving forward, I responded with the following considerations. Consideration number one: slavery isn't the only kind of oppression. When many people think of oppression, they often think of people being physically oppressed and in that they are forcibly held down or restrained or otherwise prevented from doing something that they want or need to do, including living their lives the way they see fit. Based on this understanding of the word oppression, it is understandable that someone would conclude that as soon as the shackles of slavery were removed, the institution of slavery was no longer a barrier holding people down. And from that point forward, the sky was the limit. This is often followed by justifications such as, sure, I can see how slavery was a setback, but haven't you had enough time since then to catch up? That may be been your excuse then, but what's your excuse now? One key problem with this line of thinking is that slavery isn't the only kind of oppression. At its core, a basic dictionary definition of the word oppression is prolonged, cruel, or unjust treatment or control, including mental pressure or distress. Thus, enlightened by this definition, it can be easier to see that even after one form of oppression, slavery, ended, there continued to be oppressive obstacles that impacted growth, progress, and quote unquote, catching up. Which leads to consideration number two: increased understanding of different forms of oppression reveals its consistency throughout history. The awareness of the fact that life wasn't bliss immediately after slavery is often a new concept for many. Some even go so far as to say, yes, they were free, but free to go where and with what resources? As the beginning of a conversation explaining how many transitioned from slavery to still needing to work for the very people who abused them for years, with the main difference being minimal pay, well below their worth, with little to no support and change in their overall life circumstances. After all, just because the law of the land changed doesn't mean that all of the minds in that land or the behaviors that supported it were changed. Since it would take a lot more time in this podcast to provide a thorough history of the progression of how things evolved over the years, let me suggest that while progress has indeed been made in many ways, there are still remnants, big and small, of systemic racism and oppression in impactful areas such as social, economic, and political structures. For example, the wage gap itself reflects that even with comparable degrees and professional experiences and work ethic, Black families possess disproportionately less wealth, wealth that historically reflected in part effort, but also in large part generational wealth compounded with interest, legacy hiring, and more. Speaking of which, when it comes to housing discrimination, while redlining may have ended the practice of determining who is legally allowed to live in certain neighborhoods a long time ago, a disproportionate amount of Black people are still denied home loans, despite comparable qualifications as others who are still approved to this day. Or lower home appraisals when homeowners are discovered to be Black, despite higher appraisals when those same homes are shown by white families. That reveals that even more growth is needed. In healthcare, the disproportionately lower investment in the well being of people of color has reflected persistent disparities, including healthcare access, qualities, and outcomes. Regardless of where you point a finger of blame, research reflects that Black women die more frequently due to pregnancy related reasons. Some even with admissions from doctors that they didn't provide adequate care because they believed the pain and discomfort described by Black patients were fake attempts at obtaining and abusing substances, perpetuating negative stereotypes. Or even the positive stereotypes justifying not giving pain relief or medical comfort because Black people have a higher pain tolerance and thus don't need the same decent care provided, has had devastating consequences. Educationally, school districts with majority students of color receive substantially less state funding. This may seem insignificant and unrelated to the effort of those students, but we must remember that the funding impacts the quality of the books and additional materials used in teaching. And it's common knowledge that the standardized tests often utilized in determining which students will get accepted to institutions of higher education are not only not created in ways that acknowledge everyone's life experiences, but also those who get higher scores are often those who can afford the special test prep tutors and courses and specialized instructors, not always the most intelligent or those who displayed the most effort. And regarding the criminal justice system, it's admittedly difficult to justify assuming that all judges and all lawyers and all law enforcement officers are intentionally oppressive when there are so many professionals in those same roles actively working to change not just the perceptions of their field and profession, but also the actual impact of others in those same roles. Nonetheless, while some have the privilege of just trusting that the system will work out for them, others acknowledge that for whatever reason you put your finger on, people of color experience disproportionate amounts of aggression due to law enforcement encounters. If arrested, they're more likely to be charged than others. If charged, they're more likely to be convicted than others. If convicted, they're more likely to have harsher sentences than others with the same situation. Thus, trusting the system with such disproportionate current track record is understandably difficult. There is clearly more that can be shared to broaden perspectives on various manifestations of oppression, but the exhaustiveness of this list is not really the point. Rather, the point is to show that while one form of oppression did end years ago, there have been individual as well as systemic forms of oppression that have continued to have a significant impact ever since. However, even with all that, the goal is not to provide more reasons or what can be used as excuses. Rather, the goal is to help reduce the likelihood of making the common mistake of believing that the path has been the same and thus should have produced the same results by now. With that in mind, I offer consideration number three. The anti oppression goal was never to, quote unquote, catch up to someone else. As a therapist, I see way too often people determining what success looks like by looking at someone else, what they do, what they have. To make matters worse, it can be even more convincing when those in positions of power or influence proclaim this to be the way it should be. Then those who have a different experience and different resources will continue to run from behind a race they were never intended to win. However, when we learn to determine success based on our own skills, creativity, and uniqueness, then the potential contributions that can come out of it can indeed be limitless. But this is only the beginning. Many of the famous as well as unknown people of color over the years who have done awesome things did so not by trying to be like everyone else, but by doing things their own unique way. Again, they weren't trying to be unique, but they worked only to be themselves and their uniqueness shone through. But let me be clear, this was not done in a vacuum. Without having the same resources as others, they made the most of resources available to them from supportive individuals, families, and businesses who all were working hard and saw the unearned inequalities of their situations, as well as the discouragement defying drive and commitment they displayed, and helped create changes that benefited themselves as well as those around them. This reality invites us to avoid the trap of pointing the finger of blame either at others in history and others today or oneself, but skipping the blame and excuse game of why efforts can't be made today altogether, and instead acknowledge the oppressive impact of the past on the present and its lingering continued ability to contribute to mental and emotional distress, and ultimately take steps to overcome those unnecessary and unearned barriers to success, both near and far. With this in mind, my hope for you is that you will be able to have a balanced perspective, withholding the temptation to see the past as having an oppressive stranglehold on the present, making any present effort futile, while also acknowledging the reality that things happened and ended in the past and still often have a lingering impact on how things are done today, and in ways that do not always equally impact everyone. Recognizing this alone can help you in your acceptance of yourself, as well as your empathy toward others. The less blame or excuse language we default to, the more open we are to learning what other factors there are to successes as well as struggles, and potentially being a part of positive change via the application of resources you may have to those in need around you, experiencing unearned barriers, but with the effort to make it worth it and potential for growth moving forward. And with that, I'll say thanks again for listening today to the Diversity Do podcast. If you have any diversity related questions that you'd like me to address on an upcoming podcast, or if your organization is in need of a shame free or empowering guest speaker or training on this often sensitive topic, then feel free to reach out to me directly at www.diversitymadesimple.com. And if you know of anyone else who can benefit from a positive and encouraging perspective on this often difficult topic of diversity, feel free to send them a link to this podcast so they can be encouraged as well, or send them a link to my award-winning book, Diversity in Clinical Practice, available at Amazon.com. And don't forget to visit TED.com and check out my talk on what to do when you offend someone. I hope it inspires you so that you can share it with someone else and they can be inspired as well. And as usual, I look forward to addressing as many topics as possible in future podcasts to help you improve as many relationships as possible at work, at home, and in your community. And as always, remember this: you don't need to know everything about everyone in order to have a positive impact on someone. Thank you all for tuning in and have a great day.
Tune in each week and find out how to demand and implement diversity at your job. To hear more, check out previous Diversity Dude shows on ShalettaMakesMeLaugh.com.
You know Shaletta makes you laugh, but did you know Shaletta Brundage can also make you think and boost your business? Media personality, activist, and comedian Shaletta Brundage founded Shaletta Makes Me Laugh to celebrate and share the best of Black culture. It's a podcasting platform. You can download 10 weekly podcasts hosted by African American subject experts at ShalettaMakesMeLaugh.com or wherever you find your favorite podcasts. ShalettaMakesMeLaugh.com is also a production house, creating broadcast quality commercial content. And Shaletta and her team of storytellers create powerful promotional campaigns to get businesses the brand awareness they're looking for. Some of Minnesota's top businesses trust Shaletta, and you can too. Get out the word about your events and products and get in front of communities of color with ShalettaMakesMeLaugh.com. She's got the power to help your business.
What's up, everyone? It's Shaletta. I'm here getting a phone for one of my newly minted teenagers with Xfinity Mobile. They've got great options, affordable plans, and solid coverage that works for our whole family. With Xfinity Mobile, my daughter can stay connected with me wherever she goes. And did you know when you sign up, you can get an extra phone line free for a full year? Switch to Xfinity Mobile today for more savings, more smiles, and more ways to stay connected.